It didn't happen with an explosion. There was no dramatic announcement, no single moment when the world stood up and declared, "We're done with the dollar." Instead, it started with a feeling, a quiet, uneasy shift you could sense in the background of every news headline. A war in Eastern Europe, rockets in the Middle East, prices climbing in supermarkets from London to Lagos, ships stuck at ports, factories slowing down, and governments that once spoke confidently now choosing their words with caution. Somewhere in all of this noise, the world began to ask a dangerous question. What if the system we depended on is no longer safe? For decades, the US dollar hasn't been just a currency. It was the backbone of the global economy. Countries trusted it, saved in it, traded through it, and built their futures around it. But trust is fragile. It breaks slowly, then suddenly. And over the last few years, the cracks have grown louder than the assurances holding them together. The turning point wasn't a financial crisis or a market crash. It was politics. When the United States froze foreign reserves and used the dollar as a weapon against countries it disagreed with, something changed. Nations watched closely. If Washington could shut off a country from the world's money overnight, then the dollar wasn't neutral anymore. It wasn't just a tool, it was leverage. And no country, not even America's closest partners, likes feeling vulnerable. Then came the sanctions. Dozens of them. Some justified, others questionable. But every time a new nation was cut out of the global system, the message became clearer. The dollar could be used against anyone at any time. Russia heard it. China heard it. So did Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states. Even parts of Africa, long ignored in global finance, began quietly searching for alternatives. Not out of rebellion, but out of survival. All of this was happening as inflation hammered everyday people. The same dollar that once brought stability was now exporting chaos. When the US printed trillions to survive lockdowns, other countries paid the price through soaring import costs. Suddenly, the world realized a brutal truth. One country's decisions could shake every other economy on Earth. And so, nations began to ask the question that once felt unthinkable. Why should America control the world's money? Why should a farmer in Kenya, a factory in India, or a power plant in Brazil depend on interest rate decisions made in Washington? Why should global trade rely on a currency tied to a single nation's politics, elections, and internal battles? You could feel the shift most clearly in the places that used to follow the US without hesitation. Saudi Arabia began talking to China about selling oil in yuan. Russia and China started building their own financial pipelines. African nations, tired of waiting for Western promises, began negotiating new deals with BRICS. None of these moves were loud. None were dramatic. But together, they formed a quiet rebellion, one built not on anger, but on practicality. The world isn't suddenly anti-America, it's simply becoming something the US never expected, independent. Because for the first time in decades, countries are no longer looking at the dollar as destiny. They're looking for an exit, and whether America admits it or not, the world has already begun to walk toward the door. Russia's breaking point didn't happen on the battlefield, it happened in a spreadsheet. In 2022, when the US and its allies froze Russia's dollar reserves, something shifted in the global financial system that no one could reverse. Overnight, hundreds of billions of dollars money Russia had earned, saved, and stored were locked away with a single political decision. No negotiation, no warning, just gone. To the West, it was a powerful punishment. To the rest of the world, it was a revelation. If a major nuclear power could have its national savings deleted instantly, then any country could. The message was loud, even if nobody said it out loud. Your money isn't yours if it lives inside the dollar's world. Countries that had always trusted the dollar suddenly felt exposed. Leaders in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East watched the news and quietly wondered if their own reserves could be frozen one day, not because they'd done something wrong, but because they no longer fit into Washington's plans. It was the moment many nations realized the dollar wasn't just a currency, it was a control system. Russia understood this immediately, and instead of panicking, it adapted. If the dollar could be used as a weapon, then the safest move was to step out of its line of fire. So Moscow started selling oil to China, India, and the global south without using dollars at all. Rubles, yuan, and even barter deals replaced the old system. It wasn't about rebellion, it was about survival. What Washington didn't expect was the aftermath. Once Russia proved that life outside the dollar system was possible, other nations began rethinking their own dependence. If one country could break free, maybe others could too. And that quiet realization, spreading from Moscow to Riyadh to Johannesburg, became the beginning of a global shift the US never planned for. China didn't wait for the dollar to stumble. It spent 20 years preparing for the day the world would start looking for something else. While the US assumed its position at the top would last forever, Beijing played the long game, slowly building an entire financial universe that could function without American approval, pressure, or politics. And when global tensions finally boiled over, China didn't need to fight the dollar. It simply offered the world an escape route. It started with small moves that didn't seem threatening. The digital yuan, a state-controlled, programmable currency that could move instantly across borders. Then came CIPS, China's answer to SWIFT, a payment system designed to keep money flowing even if Washington tried to cut a country out. Layer by layer, China built infrastructure. Not the kind you see on skyscrapers, but the invisible kind that keeps global trade alive. And then came Belt and Road. Ports, mines, railways, highways, energy grids, all financed by China. But the real strategy wasn't concrete, it was currency. Every loan, every contract, every long-term deal nudged nations a little further from the dollar and a little closer to the yuan. Slowly, quietly, entire regions began relying on China's financial ecosystem because it was easier, cheaper, and in a world of sanctions, safer. Africa felt it first, then Southeast Asia, then the Middle East, where even longtime US partners started settling oil and trade deals in yuan without making a headline out of it. China didn't announce a challenge. It didn't need a slogan, a speech, or a grand declaration. It just kept building, and the world followed. The truth is, China doesn't want to replace America. That would make it a target. It wants to outgrow America, to make a system so big, so convenient, so deeply woven into global trade that the dollar eventually becomes optional. And when something becomes optional, people stop depending on it. For nearly 50 years, the petrodollar was the invisible engine behind America's power. Every country that needed oil had to get dollars first, which meant the world always needed US. Currency and the U. Never had to worry about demand for it. The deal made in 1974 between Washington and Saudi Arabia shaped the entire modern financial system. But what once felt permanent began to feel fragile as the world changed, alliances shifted, and the Middle East started realizing it had more options than ever before. The breaking point didn't come with anger. It came with calculation. Saudi Arabia watched how the US treated countries that stepped out of line. It watched how sanctions were used like switches, how money could be frozen, and how agreements seemed to matter less than politics. At the same time, China became the Gulf's biggest energy customer. India became one of its fastest growing markets. The world was moving, and the Gulf didn't want to be tied to a single power anymore. So the unthinkable slowly became reality. Saudi Arabia and the UAE began settling oil deals in yuan with China, then rupees with India, then rubles with Russia, and finally, the boldest step, using their own digital currencies to settle trades within the region. The petrodollar wasn't broken overnight. It was simply replaced by something more flexible, a system where the Gulf could choose what currency worked best, not which one it was told to use. This wasn't rebellion, it wasn't some anti-American crusade, it was strategy. The Middle East realized it had leverage, influence, and enough global demand to set its own terms. And once they saw that they could trade freely without always touching the dollar, something shifted permanently. The world's most important commodity no longer had a single currency attached to it. And without the petrodollar holding the system together, America's financial dominance wasn't guaranteed. It was suddenly negotiable. For decades, Africa played by rules it didn't write. Its oil, gold, copper, cobalt, and rare earth minerals were priced in dollars. Its debts were owed in dollars. Its governments were judged by institutions built in Washington and Brussels. And every time the dollar rose, or US, interest rates jumped. African economies were hit harder than anyone else, even when they had done nothing wrong. It was a system that kept the continent dependent, predictable, and easy to control. But something changed in the 2020s. It wasn't loud, it wasn't revolutionary, it was an awakening. Countries like Kenya began settling trade with China in yuan. Nigeria pushed for local currency deals across West Africa. South Africa helped expand BRICS, opening the door for Ethiopia, Egypt, and other nations to join a financial bloc that didn't revolve around the dollar. And one by one, African governments started asking a question their parents never dared to voice. Why are we selling our resources for dollars if the dollar is the very thing keeping us in debt? France felt it first. Former colonies that once relied on the CFA franc, a currency tied to Paris, began demanding independence not through protest, but through finance. They wanted the right to manage their own money, to use their own reserves, to make their own agreements. The world called it rebellion. Africans called it dignity. And behind all of this was a deeper realization. Conflict wasn't necessary to regain control. Currency was. By trading in yuan, shillings, naira, or rand, African nations finally had leverage. They could negotiate better deals, they could escape the cycle where value leaves the continent while debt returns. This wasn't anti-Western. It wasn't about picking sides. It was about choosing themselves. A continent that had been financially boxed in for generations was finally stepping outside the walls. The old system relied on Africa staying quiet, predictable, and grateful. But a new generation of leaders and citizens saw the truth. The path to sovereignty wasn't through war or revolution. It was through breaking their dependence on a currency that never worked in their favor. Africa wasn't walking away from the world. It was walking toward its own power. And for the first time in modern history, it was doing it on its own terms. BRICS Plus isn't just a club anymore, it's a map of the future. Countries that once stood on opposite sides of global politics are now sitting at the same table, building something the world hasn't seen in decades. A financial system that doesn't revolve around the US dollar. Russia, China, India, Brazil, South Africa, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Egypt, Ethiopia. Together, they represent most of the world's people, most of its resources, and a growing share of global GDP. And they've all reached the same conclusion. The era of relying on one country's currency is over. What makes BRICS Plus powerful isn't its size, it's its purpose. These nations aren't joining forces to attack the US or tear down the dollar. They're doing it to protect themselves from a system that has become unpredictable. When sanctions can freeze your money, when SWIFT can cut you off from global trade, when interest rate hikes in Washington can crash your economy overnight, the smartest move isn't loyalty, it's insurance. So BRICS Plus began building tools the West never thought they could. New payment systems that don't need SWIFT, agreements that let countries settle trade in their own currencies, discussions about a gold-backed trade unit that wouldn't depend on any single nation's politics, and deals between members designed to make sure that if one country gets sanctioned, the whole network keeps running. This isn't fantasy. It's already happening. Russia sells oil in yuan, Saudi Arabia trades with India in rupees, China's CIPS network grows every year. Africa's BRICS members are preparing to settle cross-border payments without touching the dollar at all. History has a pattern. Every empire thinks its currency will last forever. But money only stays powerful when the world trusts the empire behind it. Rome lost its coin when its influence faded. Britain lost the pound when its empire collapsed. And now, quietly, the world is hedging against the dollar, not because it hates America, but because it no longer fears the consequences of leaving. BRICS Plus isn't declaring a new global order, it's revealing one. The shift isn't loud, it isn't violent, but it's happening and the dollar can feel it. For decades, America believed the dollar ruled the world because of its power, its military, its influence, its global reach. But that was never the real reason. The dollar didn't dominate because people feared the United States. It dominated because people trusted it. They trusted America's stability, its legal system, its institutions, and the belief that no matter how chaotic the world became, the US would remain steady. But trust is fragile, and over the last 2 decades, America slowly chipped away at its own foundation. Political fights that shut down the government, trillions printed out of thin air, debt climbing past levels once thought impossible, wars that drained resources and credibility, allies watching as every crisis seemed to create more division, not less. The world didn't lose faith in the dollar all at once, it watched America lose faith in itself. Meanwhile, countries that once relied on the US without hesitation began quietly protecting themselves. Europe, America's closest partner, started buying oil from the Middle East in yuan. Japan, historically dependent on the dollar system, bought more gold than at any point in its modern history, a silent signal that it no longer trusted the stability of global currencies. India diversified its reserves away from dollars, choosing a mix of gold, yuan, and its own currency. These weren't hostile moves, they were defensive ones. Because the truth is simple, the world isn't turning away from America because it hates America. It's turning away because the risk has become too high. When a country with the world's reserve currency shows political chaos, extreme debt, and no signs of slowing down, the rest of the world pays the price. And nations are tired of being vulnerable to decisions they don't control. The dollar was strongest when America was predictable, when its leadership was steady, when its economy felt unshakable. But today, even longtime allies are unsure. They still want America as a partner, but they no longer want to bet their futures on a system that feels increasingly unstable. The dollar isn't collapsing because of BRICS or China or Russia. It's weakening because the trust that once made it untouchable is fading quietly, steadily, and globally. And once trust fades, no amount of force can bring it back. The end of a currency era never looks dramatic while it's happening. There's no explosion, no sudden crash, no moment where a screen turns red and the world panics. Instead, it feels like this quiet, gradual, almost gentle. The dollar isn't going to fall off a cliff. It's going to fade into something more ordinary, a powerful currency, but not the currency. One option among many. Instead of the command, everyone follows. For most of our lives, the dollar felt like gravity. It held everything together: trade, banking, oil, debt, development. If you wanted to participate in the global economy, you had to use it. But that world is dissolving. Not because the US is collapsing, but because other nations finally have alternatives. New payment systems, new alliances, new currencies that serve their own interests better than the dollar ever did. We're entering a multipolar world where money isn't defined by one empire, but shaped by many. Countries will choose the currency that gives them the most freedom, not the one they're pressured to use. Oil in yuan, grain in rubles, tech in rupees. Gold backing quietly returning as a form of trust. It won't replace the dollar, it will dilute it. America isn't disappearing. Its economy, culture, and innovation still make it one of the most influential nations on earth. But influence is different from control, and the era where the US could shape the world through its currency, where a decision in Washington decided the fate of other nations, is ending. You can already feel it in the background of global politics. A soft shift, a quiet recalibration, a world beginning to stand on its own feet. The dollar was never meant to rule forever, and now the world is simply growing into its next chapter. The real question isn't whether the dollar survives. It will. The question is what happens to an empire when its greatest power, its money, is no longer unquestioned. History suggests the answer arrives quietly and then all at once.